Okay, let's continue with economic principles and talk next about rationality and incentives. So, in economics, we assume that people are rational and respond to incentives. And of course, that assumption allows us to use mathematical tools like optimization and minimization in order to make predictions about economic behavior. But let's get first a feeling for the concept of rationality and incentives. And specifically, let's have a look at how people maximize their utility when they are subject to a certain constraint. So imagine that you have a budget of $7 and you can either consume coffee or cake. And if you have 1 cup of coffee, you value the utility at 10. So that basically means you would be willing to pay up to $10 for a cup of coffee. But then if you have a 2nd cup of coffee, your total utility goes only up to 15. So that means there is an incremental increase of utility of 5. And if you had a 3rd cup of coffee, yeah, that's good, but slowly you might get tired of coffee, so the incremental or marginal utility is only 3. And if you had a 4, your total utility of 4 cups of coffee is 20, but the incremental utility is only 2. So this is what we call the law, I actually write it here, it's the law of diminishing utility. And I'm very sure many of you know that feeling that, when you're very hungry and a craving for, let's say, a cookie or so, well, if you have the first, that's really great. Having a second is still good, but the increase in extra utility from one to another is subject to diminishing utility. Okay, so now let's apply that marginal thinking to something from which we can derive rational behavior and incentives. So in short, rational people have an incentive to maximize utility or profit or to minimize cost. But now let's focus on an example of utility maximization. So you have a budget of 7, and you have to think, shall I have first a cup of coffee or shall I have first a cake? So then what you will do is you will say, how much extra utility do I get per dollar spent? So now if you have a first coffee, you get a utility that you value at 10, but you have to pay only 10. So your utility would go up from 0 to 10. So now we would say that the marginal utility for a coffee is, or per dollar spent actually, per price of coffee, that would be 10 divided by 1. So per dollar spent on coffee you get a utility of 10. What about here? What about the marginal utility of a cake per dollar spent on the cake? So we divide by the price of cake, and I'll just put it here. So that would be 8 over 2. So the first ratio is 10, so you get a extra utility of 10 per dollar spent, whereas if you bought a cake you would get only 4 units of utility per dollar spent, because 8 divided by 2 is 4. So in this case this would be greater. So therefore it would make sense for you to start with the coffee. So your first choice is coffee. Okay, so now let's eliminate that choice. Okay, so now, and also let me erase quickly this one here. Okay, so now we have to think, shall I now buy next maybe a second coffee? So if you had a second coffee, your total utility goes up from 10 to 15, but marginally or incrementally, that is an extra utility of plus 5. Again, the price of a coffee is always the same, so it's divided by $1. So if you have a second cup of coffee, the extra utility per dollar spent would be 5. What about having now maybe alternatively your first cake? Well, this is, you would get an extra utility of 8, from 0 to 8. That's 8 over the 2. So now here you still get a extra utility per dollar spent of 5, and here it is still 4. So that means even your second choice is still a coffee. So now we have already been drinking 2 coffee. So now let's see what we do next. So now I have to decide, shall I have maybe, actually let's first, we have now 2 coffees. So next we have to decide, shall I have a third cup of coffee? If I did that, I could increase my total utility from 15 to 8, which is an incremental or marginal increase of 3. So that means I'll get another 3 units of utility per $1 spent. But now if I buy my first cake, well, I get 8 extra units of utility from 0 to 8 per dollar spent. So now the ratio is 3 to 4, and I get more utility per dollar spent now if I start adding a cake to my menu. So the third choice is a cake, because now the marginal utility per dollar spent on cake is 4, but if I had a third cake, it would be only 3 extra units of utility per dollar spent. Okay, so now what is my fourth choice? So shall I have next? So now I have to decide, shall I have a second cake or a third cup of coffee? If I have a third cup of coffee, then I get an extra utility of 3 from 15 to 18. That's a plus 3. 3 per dollar spent, 3 over 1, that's 3. So but now here I get an extra utility of 5. So that's 5, but over 2, so that's 2.5, that is 3. So now again the coffee beats the cake, because the marginal utility per dollar spent is 3, and here it is only 2.50. So my next choice, the fourth choice, is again to go back to coffee. Okay, so now maybe at this point we have to see how much money do we have left. So far we have spent already 1, 2, 3. So we had 3 coffee. So our original budget was 7. So now we have to subtract 3 for the 3 coffee, and we already had 1 cake. A cake is 2, so minus 2. So now we have $2 left. Okay, great. Let's see what we can do next. So shall I have a fourth cup of coffee? In which case I would get another 2 units of utility. Or shall I have a second cake? in which I would get another 5 units of utility, but what matters is utility per dollar spent. So here it would be 2 over 1, and here would be 5 over 2. So now that means by buying a second cake instead of a fourth coffee, you get more marginal utility per dollar spent, namely 2.5 as opposed to 2. So your next choice is again to have a cake. And since a cake is another 2, that means we have no budget left anymore. That means we have exhausted all our budget, and that's it. We can't buy anything anymore. But our best choice is to have ultimately 3 coffees and 2 cake, and that will exhaust our entire budget. And you see, this is what an individually rational person would do, and we respond to incentives because we would like to get the most out of our expenditures, because we want to maximize utility. Okay, so I hope that is clear, and you have already seen a little bit the concept of marginalism, but we will talk in the next video about that in more detail as we go back again to the different economic systems that we deal with. But let's stop here, and I'll see you in the next video.